Hello from the History of Diving Museum. We are very glad that you're joining us this evening. We are here on the third Wednesday of the month at 7 o'clock for our Immerse Yourself series. I am currently out of town. Julia is going to be facilitating our discussion tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to her and she'll let people in, give you the introduction and let everybody know, please, if you are watching. Everybody's watching remotely, so go ahead and put in the chat where you're from and who you're with. And Julia, I hand it off to you.
Thanks, Lisa. So welcome everyone to this month's Immerse Yourself. Today we're going to be hearing from Tim Thomas, all the way in lovely, foggy Monterey Bay, California. He is a fisheries historian who has worked and written on Monterey's fishing history for many years. He worked with the Monterey Maritime Museum as well as the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And he will be taking us through the fascinating history, specifically of the Japanese abalone divers of Monterey Bay. Next month's program in October is currently to be decided, but be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll get news as soon as we do have a speaker for that month. We would like to thank our sponsors for September Immerse Yourself. That's Bob Murray and Barbara Overton. Bob is a board member and is very active with the museum. And Barbara received the Unsung Hero Award for her volunteer work, doing extensive research on Skin Diver magazine from the Community Foundation of the Florida Keys. So thank you both. I know they're in the chat tonight. Thank you both for sponsoring this month's Immerse Yourself. Some upcoming events, if you have not been to the museum yet to see our new featured exhibit, Aquanauts to Astronauts. That's all about the connections between diving and space travel. And that will be open until December 31st. So be sure to stop by the museum and see it if you have not already. In October, we have another event coming up on the 26th. The Thursday, the 26th, we have our treasure treat night, which we are doing for the second year in a row. It is a really fun, family-friendly event. So if you are down in the Keys for that, be sure to stop by. You can bring your kids by. They can get some candy, do some trick-or-treating, have a costume contest, some activities. It's going to be a lot of fun. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Tim, and he is going to take us through Monterey Bay's abalone fishery history.
All right. Thank you, Julia. I appreciate it. Let's see here. Oh, that's right. There we go. All right. We all see my screen there? Thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here tonight. Again, my name is Tim Thomas. I am a fisheries historian, and I've been researching the human history of Monterey Bay for about 35 years. And with a focus in the last 20 years or so, really on the Japanese story, which I always thought was sort of a unique story and one that was really undertold. And in particular, the story on the abalone fisheries of Monterey, and really of California. So I love this postcard, Greetings from the Monterey Peninsula. This is from the 1930s. Of course, I love these two ladies in the middle. I think they got big heads of lettuce. I don't know what they're doing with that thing. Well, let's get on to it here. So when abalone ruled the world, and Monterey Bay was the center of the universe. Abalone, those who don't know, of course, is just a big marine snail. And abalone, there are about 70 varieties of abalone around the world. In Monterey, in California, there's about 7 varieties of abalone. We're going to be talking primarily about the red abalone, which is the largest of the abalone and the predominant abalone in Monterey Bay. In fact, the only place in the world where abalone really isn't found is along the eastern seaboard of the United States. But you all are familiar with abalone. I mean, if you haven't eaten it, you've probably seen it. They use it for furniture inlays, the shell, of course, and buttons and all kinds of things. So it's a very important product here. But first, let's have a little history here. So the first abalone divers, and they were divers, were the native people, the Rumsen people of Monterey. Rumsen was the language they spoke, and we can trace the native culture into my area about 10,000 years or so. And abalone played a very important part of their life. They ate it. They used the shells to decorate baskets, to make jewelry, to make tools like fish hooks and shovels and bowls. And they traded to other Californians they could not get here in Monterey, in particular obsidian, which is a volcanic rock, which are usually like arrow points and spear points. And perhaps some of you out there have seen that old Kevin Costner movie called Dancing with Wolves. Yeah, that is about Indians in South Dakota. If you watch that film closely, and it comes on cable TV all the time, so it's difficult to miss. If you watch that film closely, you'll notice a lot of abalone in the clothing and the regalia that they're wearing. As far as I know, there is no abalone in South Dakota. You got to get there some way. It's going on these trade routes. A lot of it, most of it, starts right here in Monterey. Monterey literally was the abalone capital of the world. And abalone can be traced back to its point of origin. And they have found Monterey red abalone in midden sites as far back as Minnesota. As I mentioned, Rumson were the first abalone divers, and we know that from burials that have come out of the ground in recent years. And you cannot build a house along the Monterey waterfront without running across a Rumson burial or two. The males have what's known as surfer's ear, which is a little bony growth that goes over the opening of your ear for spending a lot of time in the cold water like the Monterey Bay, which makes a lot of sense, don't you think? You see an abalone the size of a hubcap, you're going to dive down there and get it. This is a wonderful drawing done by an unknown Spanish artist in the 1790s by a Rumson woman. But what I love about this drawing is it really does show you the connection to the bay here. So the inner skirt is made out of tules. This outer skirt is deer hide. These large black spots you see here, the abalone pendants. The cape that she's wearing is probably sea otter pelt. Then the necklace that she's wearing is olivella shell, little sea snails. And then the earpiece that she's wearing here, let's take a look at a close-up. This is what she's wearing in her ear, is this piece right here. I actually took this photograph a few years ago at the British Museum in London, and this piece was collected here in Monterey in the 1790s, around the same time that drawing was done, by a pretty well-known British explorer named George Vancouver. And you can see it's partly woven like a basket. In fact, at one time, there are acorn woodpecker feathers in that weave right there. And the little white, and these big white beads around the rim of the basket is where clamshell disc beads. These little white beads are olivella shell bead. Then there's some glass trade beads. Here's our abalone pendants right here. Then this long piece, this is bird bone, and bird bone is hollow. And then they create this design that we today in the maritime world would call scrimshod, and they would use squidding to get that dark color. And then she'll wear it in her ear, like you put a pencil back behind your ear. That's how she keeps it right there. And oftentimes, as they weave these beautiful baskets, to weave into the basket, little abalone pendants, clamshell disc beads, olivella shell beads, but particularly abalone. In fact, the word abalone comes from the Rumson people, and abalone is used all over the world today. And the Rumson had a word for the red abalone. That word is Alun, A-U-L-U-N, and then linguists have traced that word abalone all the way back to that word Alun that starts right here in Monterey. And so if you are a Rumson fisherman and you go out into Monterey Bay for a loon or anything else out there, you want it to be a beautiful day. Well, I got to tell you, it isn't always like that here in Monterey, contrary to popular belief, especially in the summer. In fact, this morning, when I got up this morning, it was very dense and foggy out there. So the Rumson people actually had a song that they would sing to get rid of the fog. Now, I'm not going to sing it for you, but knowing I do this tour today, I got into my time machine this morning. I went back in time and I recorded them singing that song, so I'm going to play it. See what happens here.
وسيهيهم أرابات تيهوان وسيهيهم أرابات تيهوان وسيهيهم أرابات تيهوان وسيهيهم أوت ew. And if you sing it long enough, it works. Guaranteed.
And what that song is saying in Rumson, it's telling fog to go home beyond the bay out there because Pelican is out there and he is beating your wife. He's flying through the fog. So here is my friend Linda Yamane, who is a Rumson descendant and probably the world's leading scholar on Rumson people. And I'll let you in on a little secret. I didn't really go back in time. In fact, that's Linda singing that song. This is in her tule boat that she made, and she's actually paddling around in the tide pool, the great tide pool at the Monterey Bay Aquarium there. And you can see her in her beautiful abalone necklaces right there. And this is one of those necklaces that she made for a museum actually in Japan. And you can see the beautiful abalone, red abalone, and the olive shell beads that went around it. And then here's Linda again. This is taken a number of years ago, but on the beach in Monterey, where that song would have been sung 5,000 years ago. And here she is in all her beautiful abalone regalia and her big red abalone shell in her hand right there. And then, of course, this is one of her baskets. Linda is probably the first Rumson basket weaver in 150 years that we know of, and probably the first feathered basket weaver in at least 300 years that we know of. And she made several of these now for various museums throughout California. And this beautiful basket took a number of years to make. You can see the olive shell beads and abalone pendants that are hanging here. The red feathers would historically and traditionally be acorn woodpecker feathers, but because it's difficult to get acorn woodpecker feathers, at least that many today, it would actually take several hundred acorn woodpeckers to give up their lives to get enough feathers. So she had to use chicken feathers and cut them down, and it took a long time to get the right color dyes to use it till they look like the acorn woodpecker feathers. But it's a beautiful basket right there. These are Chinese fishermen arriving in Monterey in the early 1850s. The fact that it was a small group of Chinese fishermen and their families, that's important, sailed across the North Pacific in 3 small 30-foot junks. There's actually a series of currents will push them all the way across. Chinese call that the black tide or the big drain. Come up somewhere near Cape Mendocino, Northern California, turned right, set on the California coast, actually overshot Monterey, ended up in Mexico, had turned around to fight these currents back, finally landed out at Point Lobos, which is about 5 miles south of the town of Monterey. It's now a California state park. But they were taken in by a Rumson village that was out there that nursed them back to health. When they got healthy, later that day out there, and they said, hey, nobody's fishing out there. And the reason nobody fished out there, because at that time there was no way to get fresh fish to big markets like San Francisco because the railroad hadn't arrived here yet. But the Chinese understood the technology of drying all their catch, and that's a really big deal. They dry all their fish, and then once a month, this big Chinese junk would come down from San Francisco and pick up all that dried fish, and they'd ship it back to China. They're shipping to other Chinese camps along the West Coast here, but they're also selling fresh fish to local citizens here in Monterey, so they actually brought an economy here. And the next year, another wave came around 1853 or so and settled in this village site here, where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. And if you look closely in the image, you'll notice these children, these kids were born here, American citizens. What the Chinese noticed, besides all the fresh fish, of course, was the abalone, which brought all kinds of other Chinese fishermen from San Francisco, other parts of California, rushing to Monterey to get all this abalone. In fact, the San Francisco papers referred to it as an abalone rush, because the abalone is a prized thing in China. In fact, only at that time, only royalty was allowed to have abalone. So to be able to come here and get it like that, it was a really big deal for the Chinese fishermen. Here's a picture of their village in Pacific Grove. In fact, the Monterey Bay Aquarium would be right about here. The name of this village was Point Alones. And if you look at a 19th century map of Monterey, and anybody's been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Point Alones is right where the deck of the aquarium is today. So we'll get to it. Here is our Japanese story. So this is a group of Japanese businessmen. This is a group called the Japanese Association. And these are businessmen that were established in 1908. And they're mostly businessmen associated with the Monterey Wharf and really the abalone industry. It was fishing that brought the Japanese to Monterey, and it was particularly abalone that brought the Japanese to Monterey. This gentleman right here, his name is Otto Sabaru Noda. Noda was hired in about 1897 by the land arm of the Southern Pacific Railroad called the Pacific Improvement Company. They were a huge conglomerate at that time. Southern Pacific Railroad had just purchased a smaller railroad that was here in Monterey. And then when they purchased the railroad, they also bought 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula because they had this funny, kind of quirky idea that they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who thinks such a thing? So Noda was hired. He was kind of a labor contractor, and he was bringing in other Japanese laborers to clear land, and he was supplying food for them. He was supplying water and wood for these camps. He was working up on a tree one day near the Monterey Harbor, He looks down into the harbor and he sees all this abalone down there. In fact, so much abalone, he actually described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone, and nobody doing with it. And the reason nobody's doing anything with it because nobody knew what the heck you're supposed to do with it. Unless you're preparing abalone properly, it is kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese, who were dealing with abalone for centuries, they knew what to do with it. So Noda-san writes his letter back to the government of Japan and said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends this guy right here, whose name is Jinosuke Kodani, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. He comes over and goes, oh, this is great. Not only is there a lot of abalone, these abalone are big. He sends back to Japan for abalone divers known as ama, or free divers. Here's a closer-up picture of our friend Noda-san and Kodani here, right here. In between that time, Noda actually goes down to what is now Cannery Row and leases a piece of property down there. And he sends back to Japan for other fishermen and creates this Japanese fishing colony on that site down there. Also in 1902, he opens the very first sardine cannery that's on Cannery Row on that site down there called Monterey Fishing Canning Company. So here are ama divers. They arrived here, 3 of them actually arrived here in October of 1898. And I know who they are. I've actually seen their passports. They're picked up at the train station here in Monterey and taken down to Noda's campsite. Got dressed that first morning in traditional ama gear, which you can see consists of this little white cotton outfit here. Here's the abalone basket, abalone pry right here, and a pair of goggles. Here are the goggles here that had pig's bladders on the end that they would squeeze to help release the pressure. So they got dressed up first morning, went into the bay, jumped into the water, and about 10 seconds later, they jumped back out. They said, Kadani-san, you didn't tell us how cold that water is. There's about a 15-degree water temperature difference between Monterey and Japan. That is a huge, huge difference. We make a lot of this, but the truth is they were ama diving in Monterey into the 1920s because it was tradition. It was what they knew how to do. They were really good at it. This is actually a photograph from Japan of a couple ama divers, but they pretty much did the same way here in Monterey. They worked in pairs on a boat. The difference in Monterey, there would be a barrel in the middle of this boat that had a fire going on constantly. And then one diver would go into the water and he'd have a rope tied around his waist, and that would go through a pulley system. And then he would go into the water. He'd go down 40, even 50 feet into the bay. Now, keep in mind, near ama, there's no air supply for them. So they're holding their breath, right? These guys can hold their breath, some of them up over 4 minutes. And when he's ready to come to the surface, his partner on the end of the boat would take the other end of that rope, which had a weight attached to it, usually just a big rock, and then toss it over the side of the boat that would yank that guy up back to the surface where he'd warm himself up on the fire while his partner goes into the water. And they repeated this all day, going back and forth. You'll see in this image too, here's an abalone basket right there that would go down with them to collect abalone. And then also you can see the sculling oar, which they brought to Monterey as part of their tradition here. So here is the site where Noda's campsite was, and where his first cannery was. It eventually became other canneries are on this site. The second still looks like this. I took this picture a few years ago, right down there. This is a label. This is actually pretty rare. This is a label of Noda's Monterey Fishing and Canning Company. It only operated for about 7 years, from 1902 to 1907. I actually found this on eBay, which is very rare. eBay was the museum curator's best friend at one time. There's our Mr. Kodani there, a handsome young man. So Kodani made his way around the Monterey Peninsula eventually and found his way into Point Lobos. And if anybody's been to California, been to Monterey, or you've been to Point Lobos, you'll know why they went there. Point Lobos, a good friend of mine, another historian, likes to say that Point Lobos is the center of the universe. And it really is a beautiful place. It's the jewel of California state parks. That's what they call it. It really is. And it looks a lot like Japan. It's just amazing how much it looked like Japan. And so he wandered to that place and just fell in love with it. He was comfortable there, and he was able to lease a piece of that property actually from this guy here. This is a guy named A.M. Allen. A.M. Allen was a progressive thinker for his time, a very forward-thinking man. He was a mining engineer, and he was he was a partner in a coal mine that was at Point Lobos at that time. and the company was producing a really low grade coal, so they weren't making any money. And so the company decided to sell off the property, but they weren't able to really sell it. They were partially off for home lots, but it was a tough sell. Nobody wanted to live out there. It was so away from town. There was no way to get back and forth. And so Alan finally decided that he could do something more with that property. So he bought it from his partners, and then he leased a piece of property to Kodani. He watched them operate for about a year and said, hey, this is an interesting business. There's money to be made here. And he became Kodani's partner in the abalone business at Point Lobos. Here is their cannery. This is a business. This is what they now call Whalers Cove at Point Lobos. You can still go right down there. Still looks exactly like this, except these buildings aren't there anymore. But they also used to quarry granite out of here at one time. Parts of San Francisco are built out of the granite that was quarried out of here in the 19th century. But they built the cannery as well. This is the cannery here, where they were actually beginning to can abalone, that they were trying to sell it to the Western market. It was still, no pun intended, a tough sell. And they were marketing it to Japan, because what the Japanese were doing with all that abalone was they were drying it, and they were then shipping it back to Japan in big burlap sacks. And if there was any problem on the ship hold gets full of seawater, which could happen. It would ruin that hold of dried abalone. But what they found out, though, was the Japanese didn't want the canned product. They wanted that dried product. Dried abalone in Japan to this day is really a revered product, not just as a food source, but dried abalone is considered to be very special. It's considered to be good luck. Oftentimes, if you get a wedding card or a birthday card or a New Year's, you'll find stripped dried abalone inside that card. And of course, you can also put it in water, reconstitute it, or you can just chew it almost like jerky. But it's a very revered product. But they were canning it here, and they were steaming it in the can like they cooked sardines in Monterey at that time. Here's Kodani standing in a big pile of red abalone shell right between those two buildings. You can see him right there. And then here's one of my favorite paintings. This is the greatest, at least in the historic world, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest painting of Monterey that ever was painted. This is done by a French artist in 1875 called The City of Monterey. And I just adore this painting. And you can see the Monterey Valley narrow gauge, which was the first railroad to come to Monterey in 1874, coming into the train station here. And you can see two whale boats here pulling in a whale. And then here's the Pacific Steamship Company wharf here. But here is what we now call today Del Monte Beach, all this whalebone on the beach right here. Then the guy in the wagon right here has got whalebone in the back of that wagon. And there's whole industries developed around this whalebone. And one time, all the sidewalks were in Monterey were made out of whalebone. But how does this tie into our abalone story? Because they also made products like this. They were selling to tourists who are now coming to Monterey. So this is the San Carlos Cathedral, which was the first church here in Monterey. And you can see it's all made out of whalebone and with all this abalone inlay inside this here. This is actually what they call a votive candle holder, what that is right there. Another eBay thing I found many years ago. All right, so this is where you would have bought that kind of thing. If you're a tourist coming to Monterey, you would have gone to the Duarte family store. They had a number of businesses along the waterfront that catered to that tourist trade. And you can see Marine Museum and glass bottom boats. And you can see all the abalone shells right here that he was selling to the tourists. He was also a taxidermist, whalebone products. This is whalebone vertebrae with the Carmel Mission painted on it. Here is a whalebone chair right here. I've actually sat in one of these chairs. They're not very comfortable. And then here, so around the turn of the century, the Japanese began to experiment with the helmet gear. It was far more efficient than the old Ama style. They initially used American gear, but they didn't like it. And so they began to use gear from Japan, mostly from a company in Tokyo. They liked the Japanese gear. They said the suits felt like silk, and the American suits felt like really rough. They didn't like wearing them. They really liked the Japanese gear. And here's Mr. Kodani. You can see him right here. And what I love about this photograph as I can tell if this gear is all new because there are no dents in the helmet right here. Here's another photograph. This was taken at Point Lobos, and the two abalone boats here. This is behind them here. So these divers are coming from Japan. Janosuke Kodani's younger brother name was Nakajiro Kodani, and he came to Monterey with those first initial Alma divers. And he actually was a trained marine biologist. And then he went back to Japan, and he kind of lived in a town called Curator, where all these divers would come from. And he kind of was an agent. He would sign them up and send them to Monterey, and they would work on contracts. And they weren't here on a permanent basis. A diver's life like this was about 10 years. And so they would live out at Point Lobos here, and this is where they would live. There's a bunkhouse here and a cookhouse out here, and they had also racks where they would dry the abalone. They actually took old Monterey whale boats. There was a Monterey Portuguese whale fishery in Monterey that developed in the early 1850s that had died out in the 1870s. They took over their whaling boats and converted it into abalone dive boats, added the copper panel to the side of the boat so they could pull up their abalone baskets without hurting the boat here. So all these guys are Japanese guys, with the exception of this guy here, who's an old Portuguese whaler who went to work for the company here. And then there's A.M. Allen in this photograph here. But again, look at the dive gear here. You can tell, or I can tell, that the gear is new because there's no dents in the helmet here. Then you can see the hand pump here. So here is the helmet after several years of use, and you can see that it's been cracked. There's dents in the helmet because the currents are strong right in the bay, and oftentimes they get thrown up against the side of a rock or other rocks, smaller rocks that kick up from the bottom, hit them in the helmet, and all kinds of problems can happen to the diver. And they kept their heads down, their helmets down as they're got in the water diving down. In the early days, when they're hand pumping the air down to the diver, that's how they would do it. The diver would go down 30, 40, 50 feet into the Monterey Bay. The deeper they went, the harder it was to pump. Then in the 1920s, they put air compressors on the boat. So now they're pushing the air to the diver with a motor. So now that diver's going down 50, 60, 80, even up to 100 feet into the Monterey Bay. But at that level, you can't see anything. I mean, so you're on your hands and knees crawling around trying to find stuff. And also at that level, you can't stay down there very long. So you have to work your way up very, very slowly to this 30-foot level where they would be down there all day collecting abalone. Here's one of those divers. And so these divers learn very quickly, even the helmet divers, that bay is very cold. And so they all learn to be knitters. They take wool sweaters and tear them apart, and they knit this wool underwear, put on a pair of that, sometimes two pairs of that, put on their clothes, put on a big heavy canvas suit, attach about 65 pounds of the lead weight to the front and back, tie lead to their shoes, bolt on this helmet, which of course has a hose attached to it, then go down into the Monterey Bay. Eventually there was that dive company in Tokyo began to produce that wool underwear strictly for the divers that were here in Monterey. So here's a couple of those divers that came to Monterey. This is a Mr. Yamaguchi and Mr. Kawagami. They all come from a particular area in Japan, the Chiba Prefecture, but way down into the Chiba Prefecture, known as the Boso, a beautiful little peninsula, a little town called Chikura. It looks a lot like Monterey, as I mentioned. And I've been there many times. And first time I ever went there, I was given this little tour of the neighborhood. And my sort of counterpart there is pointing out all the houses. He says, diver house, diver house, diver house. All these houses that divers lived in that came to Monterey over 130 years ago. Well, for the most part, the families still own those houses. They don't necessarily live in them, but they own them. So I went to visit them. And the first thing I saw in every house, number one, they had this portrait of their relative that came to Monterey. And if you look closely at it, number one, you notice they're all dressed Western style. Well, first thing the Japanese did was they got Western clothing. But if you look down bottom, it says F.L. Swain Portraits, Monterey, California. Every house, and I went to sell them, all had these portraits of their relative. And then and again, here's the photograph of those same two divers here. Here's Mr. Kawagami, Mr. Yamaguchi here. And this is at Point Lobos. And there is Mr. Kodani here the hand on the hand pump that you see right there. Again, hand pump coming from Japan. This is the house of Mr. Kawagami in the city of Chikura in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. And so we're going to go inside. As I mentioned, the first thing we saw were those portraits, but also every single house has this shrine to Monterey. We had no idea these things existed until about 20 years ago. None. Every single house had one of these. I was just stunned. Look at these abalone shells. These are world record size. You could take a bath in this shell. That's how big it is. They came out of Monterey Bay over 130 years ago. Abalone grows very, very slow in the wild. In the farm situation, they raise abalone in farms today. It'll grow about 1 inch a year. In the wild, they grow much, much slower. This abalone is over 100 years old to get to be that big right there. This doll you see right here was purchased at Homer's department store in Pacific Grove, which is the town next door to Monterey, in 1927, now a family heirloom. Also, this is another thing that was just stunning that we didn't know. This is called a maiwai. These are indigenous to that part of Japan in the Chiba prefecture. It's a fishing community. They fish for all kinds of things there, including abalone. And what it is, at the end of a good fishing company, that fishing owners will give their fishermen this piece of painted fabric that they in turn will have this represents their particular fishery. The fishermen will then in turn have this jacket made that they'll wear for special events, to temple and to all kinds of different things. But this one is special. It's got the American flag, Japanese flag. E-Day and Company. E-Day was a partner of Noda. E-Day and Company, Monterey, USA. This was from here. We had no idea these existed till 20 years ago. None whatsoever. There are only 2 of these that exist in the world today. There was less than 10 of them were made. They were made about 1900. They were something the fishermen would have got not here in Monterey, but got when they returned back to Japan. But the 2 that exist, there's one on permanent exhibit at a museum in Tateyama, Japan, which is also in the Chiba prefecture on that peninsula. And one I'm proud to say I have in my little museum here in Monterey at the Japanese American Citizens League Heritage Center. The family, Mrs. Kurohawa, gave it to us to bring back to Monterey to honor her grandfather, who came with the first helmet divers. And she was very apologetic when she gave it to us because it's not in the best condition. It's kind of torn and faded, unlike the one that's at the Tateyama Museum. That one is in beautiful condition. It looks like it's new. But then she explained to us that after World War II, their family, like many Japanese families, were destitute. And this is all they had to wear was this beautiful jacket. So we are honored to have it here in Monterey. So there was a lot of suspicion about the Japanese and what they were doing in Monterey. In fact, as I'm sure you all know, at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States, coming primarily from white workers who are convinced the Japanese are coming to take their job, which really wasn't the case. So there was a lot of suspicion. This is a newspaper story that I actually found from a newspaper in Birmingham, Alabama in 1908. And it says, "Yellow spies work Frisco." And now what the story goes on to say is, it talks about the Japanese abalone fishermen. It says, disguised as innocent fishermen, Japanese engineers take surveys and soundings of Monterey, finding the bay unobstructed. And what they say in the story is they don't believe the Japanese are actually taking abalone, but what they were, because no one was buying it, right? So what they're actually doing is they were mapping the Monterey Bay to prepare for the Japanese army to land in Santa Cruz and then march over the Santa Cruz Mountains and take the town of San Francisco. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Right, so here's a canned abalone. This is actually a reproduction of canned abalone. I was a guest curator for an exhibit at that museum in Tateyama, Japan, where we created some of this kind of material, as only the Japanese can do now. I actually have this on exhibit at my museum now here. There's a label for the canned product that was being produced. As I mentioned, the Japanese didn't want the canned product. In 1913, the state of California made it illegal for the Japanese to send dried abalone out of the state of California. They could send the canned product They couldn't send the dry product, but they didn't want that canned product. Here's the Japanese version of that label that they were sending out right there. But this is a photograph taken in 1930. A.M. Allen died in 1930. And the Japanese in Japan were so appreciative of him supplying jobs to these men who were sending that money home to Japan, keeping their families alive, that they held a memorial service for him in the temple in Chikura. This temple is actually right above that home I showed you a picture of in Chikura, of Mr. Kawagani's house. Here is Mr. Kawagani right here. And I've been to this temple, actually, it still looks like that. And this is Nikajiro Kodani right here, Janosuke Kodani's younger brother right there, who's actually buried at this temple today. So once the state of California made it illegal for the Japanese to ship dried abalone, I mean, that was their business. What are they going to do? This man saves the day. This is a German restaurateur named Pop Ernest Dulter. Pop Dulter came to Monterey in 1908, 1907, opened a small little European-style restaurant on Alvarado Street, downtown Monterey, sort of a bohemian-style, European-style restaurant where we go and spend the whole evening in the restaurant. In those days, believe it or not, people didn't eat a lot of seafood, and the fisheries, all their market was not here, but really was in San Francisco. But people did eat oysters. People ate a lot of oysters, not just here, but everywhere. And so, but they don't get a lot of oysters in Monterey. So he had to bring the oysters from San Francisco. They'd come by train. You know anything about trains? Trains have a tendency to break down. There'll be a cow on the tracks. And the shellfish or any kind of sea product won't stay fresh very long. Oftentimes he'll go to the train station to pick up his order of oysters, and they'll be spoiled. So he's always looking for something new he could serve in his restaurant. And he was watching all this dried abalone leaving the Monterey Bay. He said, abalone, yeah, kind of like a big oyster. So he brought it to his restaurant one day, experimented with it. Finally comes with this famous recipe where you slice the foot. That's you're eating abalone is the foot, because it's just a big marine snail. Pound it. You don't just pound it. There's a certain technique to pounding it. You run it through egg wash, cracker crumbs, and cook it up quickly on butter and olive oil. And soon people came from all over to eat fresh abalone steaks in Pop's restaurant. And they'd sing songs and write poetry. Like some folks boast the quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. George Sterling, the very famous California poet, wrote that in his guest books in 1913. That's an ad for Pop's restaurant. This earlier for Toke Point oysters on Alvarado Street. Here he is standing in the front of his very first restaurant on Alvarado Street there in Monterey. Here is the interior of that restaurant in Monterey where he invented the abalone steak. And then here he is again inside that very same restaurant. And this whole family all worked in the restaurant. So all the waiters, this is his daughter here. Here's Pop here, a young Pop, and the restaurant. And I see the American flags you see here. So in 1908, the Great White Fleet came to Monterey. That's Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. I won't go into that whole history, or we'll never get done today, but he opened a saloon next door to his restaurant to profit on that. And that's, I'm sure, why those flags are right there. The same year that he invented the abalone steak into his restaurant there. He also catered all kinds of abalone dinners, and here he is catering out of Point Lobos. He's right here. These are all a bunch of bohemians. You'll actually see in this crowd Mary Austin and Jack London and George Sterling are all in this crowd here having an abalone dinner out of Point Lobos. This is the guest book from Pop's restaurant with that famous George Sterling stanza. You may know, if you don't know the abalone song, I encourage you to Google it. A lot of things will come up about it. And there are literally hundreds of these now that started in this restaurant in 1913. This is in 1913, Pop went to San Francisco. He was offered a job at a restaurant called the Hofbrau to bring his recipes to San Francisco. And so this is the menu for the Hofbrau restaurant. And here's a close-up of that. You can see glued to the bottom of that menu is this abalone specials, abalone cocktail, 25, those are 25 cents, abalone salad, abalone nectar in the cup, hot or cold. That's just the juice that came out of the shell. This is the first time ever abalone appeared on a printed menu, was right then. And then this is an ad that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle at least once a week. The cleanest, wholesomest shellfish is the abalone. Clings to the rocks and feeds on seaweed and mosses. We get them daily by express, direct from Point Lobos, Carmel Bay, packed in seaweed. They arrive here not only fresh, but alive and kicking. All right, so California welcomes the world. The 1915 World's Fair comes to San Francisco called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. It was really a World's Fair to honor the opening of the Panama Canal. If you ever been to San Francisco, the Palace of Fine Arts that was built for that World's Fair. In fact, the whole area was once just a big mud flat, and they filled it all in for this World's Fair, about 600 acres. All kinds of new things introduced this World's Fair. Every state was represented. California had the largest of the state buildings. All kinds of new parts introduced at this World's Fair. So let's go visit. Here's our ticket. Let's go to the Monterey County visit. Monterey County had a huge exhibit in the California State Building. And what did we notice at Monterey County is our abalone diver. Look, there he is. Look at all this abalone shell you see right here. There's our abalone diver. Here's the back end of it here. You can see the dive weights and the hose and the abalone cans. And then again, all different kinds of abalone you see right here. Not just red abalones. There's white abalone. There's green abalones, black abalones, all in that picture right there. Then the Point Lobos Canning Company, Kodani's company, was giving away samples of canned abalone to the guests at the fair and sending folks down to the Hofbrau for free or to buy full abalone dinners. And soon the whole world wanted this product. Hotels, restaurants, all wanted this new sensation, abalone. And soon Pop said there's money to be made here. He eventually comes back to Monterey, opens a small restaurant on the very first restaurant on the Monterey Wharf. Actually, he opened a restaurant, first restaurant in San Francisco on Bush Street, and you can see called Pop Ernest. A place to eat morning, noon, and night, specialized on seafood, game, and poultry. Big deep sea mussels not known before in San Francisco. Exclusive abalone a la Ernest in various solid and liquid forms. This restaurant only operated for about a year. As you can imagine, this was by 1918. There was a great deal of anti-German sentiment in this country because of World War I going on in Europe. And so he shut it down and came back to Monterey, actually lived out of Point Lobos and worked with Kodani and Allen and produced a method to produce abalone steaks. And they were shipping them to restaurants, hotels along throughout California here. But he does open another restaurant in 1919 at the Monterey Wharf. This is his first restaurant here, and here is Pop, you see right there, with his son Carl right there. Initially called the Club because it was in the old Monterey Yacht Club, but eventually became known as the Abalone King. And because of Pop's recipe that he developed, by 1916, Japanese companies were bringing in 600,000 pounds of red abalone every season into Monterey Harbor. By 1920, there were 9 full-time Japanese abalone companies operating off the Monterey Wharf. In 1929, the California abalone industry was bringing in close to $1 million in revenue. That's a $1929, $1 million in revenue. 75% of that was out of Monterey Bay. Prior to World War II, 90% of the businesses on the Monterey Wharf were Japanese-owned, fish markets, abalone processors, all because of that recipe that German restaurateur invented in his Monterey restaurant in 1908. Very, very important. This is a drawing, this is my old friend Roy Ettore, actually, but this is a drawing done by a guy named Ray Scholl, and I'm going to run through this because I'm going to run out of time here. This was done for a mural that was here in Monterey about 2006. And for a building, a NOAA building here in Monterey. And you can see that's Roy, and there's Roy there. Roy is very important. Roy was the first only abalone diver that was born here, not just in Monterey, but first abalone diver born in California like this. So he was Nisei, he was second generation. As I mentioned, all of the divers came to Japan, with just a couple of exceptions returned to Japan. But Roy was born here in 1919. So I asked him how he learned to do this. He told me when he was a young man, he had just graduated from Monterey High School. His father wanted to get into the abalone business. During the Depression, had a lot of debts to pay. He thought this would be a good way to make some money. But he had no experience in this business whatsoever. They had friends who were in it. He borrowed some equipment, takes a little boat in the middle of the Monterey Harbor, and he dressed him up in this wool underwear. In fact, Roy told me his mother knitted this underwear, puts on his clothes, puts on a big heavy canvas suit, attaches the 65 pounds of the lead weights to his front and back, ties the lead to his shoes, bolts on the helmet, then he just tossed him off the side of the boat. Says, you start running down there. That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Luckily, the older divers took him to the wing, kind of showed him what to do. So here's all the equipment they would have used. Here's the dive gear. Again, as I mentioned, all came from Japan. The dive suit. Here are the weights you see here. 2 abalone baskets you see here. Here's the lifeline. Here's the helmet, the collar that would go over the suit, and then it would bolt the helmet down onto. You see right there. Of course, the wrench down here to tighten those bolts up. You see right there. And then here's Roy getting dressed to go out there down into the bay here. This is his brother and cousin. So by 1920, they're going out for 3-day abalone cruises. There would be a mother boat and the dive boat. The mother boat pulling the dive boat, and then the dive boat would go out and do all the diving for the abalone. And then here's Roy getting ready to go diving into the Monterey Bay right there. And then here he is going down the ladder, going right down there. And then here he is just ready about to submerge. So I asked Roy, I said, Roy, did you have any problems down there? As I mentioned earlier, the currents would be really strong and kick up rocks. And one time he told me a rock kicked up, hit the helmet, and cracked the glass on his helmet. Now you're 30 feet below the Monterey Bay and you just crack the glass on your helmet. What are you going to do? I mean, you want to get to the surface, right? But it'll take a long time. They can't just pull him up. He weighs way too much. He has to release this valve on his helmet that will fill the suit with air that'll float him back up. That'll take a really long time. So what he did, and I think this is the most amazing thing, he reaches into his abalone basket, pulls out that abalone, which is just a big marine snail, takes the abalone, sticks it in the glass, and the abalone seals up the crack. Stop the water from coming in. Change the glass, goes to the surface, they change the glass. He starts all over again. He told me that's pretty smart. Yeah, that is. He actually told me that older divers taught him how to do that. That was a common problem down there. So here is the dive boat. You can see that this is that Roy, the lifeline here. This is Roy's brother and cousin. And you can see the guy on the skull here. The sculling oar, as I mentioned, came from Japan. With the sculling oar, you didn't need to use a motor. You just used the skull, and you would track the diver by his bubbles. And then if there was a motor on the boat, so they could move it around different places and get back to the mother boat. And here's the motor here. It's got a covering over it, but you'll notice the tea kettle and then the shoes. So I asked Roy about that, and he told me, yeah, when you got that water, Monterey Bay average is about 55 degrees. You're down there for several hours at a time. He said he'd be shaking for 25, 30 minutes. That's how cold it was. So we had hot water constantly because of the sitting on that engine cover there for tea, and his shoes are always hot. He put them on his feet to warm up his feet there. And then this is a very rare image of a dive crew operating. This was taken down near Big Sur, and it was a favorite place for them to go. And you can see the dive boat here, the 3 guys on the boat. Here is the skull here, and then here's the dive hose here, and you can see the bubbles here as the diver operating down there. And then here they are pulling up an abalone basket, full of abalone here, and they're holding on. So they'll pull one up, send another one down. So when Roy's filled one up, he'll pull in the lifeline with a certain signal that they'll send it back up. And then they'll bring it back up to the surface. And nice picture of them on the skull right there. And then they'll bring all that abalone into Monterey. This is the mother boat. And you can see 2 abalone suits being dried here. And this is another technology that came from Japan. These are called live boxes. And that's how they kept the abalone fresh for those 3 days. These are actually made in Monterey, made out of redwood. And they would pile the abalones on top of each other inside these boxes and kept them in the water for 3 days. And then they brought them back to Monterey to unload. Again, this is at the Monterey Wharf. And then they would unload all the abalone. As I mentioned, there were 9 different companies operating. And abalone seasons could last long. Some of them were 9 months at a time. So they'd come in 3 days at a time, 200 dozen large red abalone each boat. That's a lot of abalone. You can see them on the deck there, into the box there, and into the cannery. These are all Japanese workers inside the cannery here. And you can see they're pulling out the abalone out of the shell. All these women, that's what they're doing there. And then these guys are actually cleaning the abalone here. Roy's mother actually had her own cannery on the wharf. And Roy told me he dove for the family, and then he would work in another cannery when he wasn't diving abalone to make money, because he was a teenager, so he could go out on dates and things. And so they are cleaning abalone there. And then this lady is pulling it out of the shell there. and then slicing them to make those big abalone steaks. And then again, they would pound them, Pop Ernest style, to go to all the restaurants and things like that. And then into the boxes there to be shipped. And then again, our friend Pop Ernest, who was so important to the story. And then this is his new restaurant they opened in 1919. He died in 1934, and his two sons continued to operate the restaurant. They actually operated until 1952, and this is taken about 1938. But I just love the octopus painted on the side of the building here and the neon sign there. And then inside the restaurant, a very beautiful nautical scene right there. And Pop was a master at himself and marketing his restaurant. So here he is on the deck of his restaurant in 1925. These two ladies are eating abalone stew that he was famous for, and he would actually serve the stew inside the actual abalone shell. Now notice Pop always wore a fez, always wore this red fez. Nobody knows why, not even his family knows why. I believe it was a marketing tool. People remembered him. More importantly, people remembered his restaurant. Here's a famous menu of Pop. This was a giveaway. This menu was this menu was done by two very, very famous Monterey artists. They did it for free abalone dinners. The middle section was done by a guy named Joe Mora, very famous Western artist. Then the outer section was done by a guy named Armin Hansen. Now go home tonight, Google those names. A lot of stuff will come up about those guys. But both of them are international known artists today. Here is Pop's international. Here's Pop's abalone stew. This is obviously from an exhibit that I have at the museum here in Monterey, but it was made by the exhibit I did in Japan in the abalone shell. But here is actually one of Pop's actual shells that he served the abalone stew in, and he filled the holes of the shell with lead right there. So he had his own dive crew. This is his own boat. Pop on his dive boat there. There's Pop on the Monterey Wharf, all these abalone shells. So they couldn't do any of these shells. The state of California made it illegal to export the shells out of California for various different reasons that I won't go into tonight or will never get done here. So the shells are just dumped off the side of the wharf, and they're trucked out to a town called Seaside or Sand City, which is right next to Monterey, where they dumped in the sand dunes out there. But different industries are developed around these shells. Here's a big pile of those shells that were out in Seaside out there. Particularly a company called Slom in Southern California, SALM, began to produce products like this. They're selling all over the United States. And they take the abalone shell and they would cut it and glue a piece of redwood. Looks like an airplane. This says Souvenirs, Salinas, California. Notice the thermometer. That was a theme. And then here is an anchor. This is a souvenir of Atlanta, Georgia. Of course, nothing says Georgia like abalone, right? Here's some salt and pepper shakers. This is from Hibbling, Minnesota. Again, this is all Monterey red abalone, all glued onto pieces of redwood. And then this is from my exhibit in Monterey. You see all the different products of curios that were being sold all over the United States of red abalone products. You see right there. It's an abalone spoon that was made in Monterey and sold probably by the Duarte brothers in 1898, right there. And then in the 1950s, the late 50s, a guy named Charlie Heiler opened the very first aquarium in Monterey on the Monterey Wharf. It was the Wharf Aquarium. Here it is, taken in the 1950s. And I remember it. I grew up in Monterey, and I remember in the early 60s, we'd go down there, and it was sort of this funky little aquarium, had a number of sort of tropical fish, and had a sea turtle, and it had a sea lion in the back, and for 25 cents, you could buy a bag of squid and you could feed the sea lion. But the best part was you could go into their gift shop where you could buy shells and things, but you could buy baby alligators, live baby alligators for $1, which we would buy and take home, let them go in our backyard because we were convinced they're going to be giant alligators. Of course, I'm sure some raccoon ate them immediately, but so I don't know about those baby alligators. But he also made things like this. He'd take that abalone shell, put this resin. He's selling this stuff all over the United States. You can see it with the abalone shell embedded into that resin. He also made this key. Again, you'll see the thermometer right there. And then he also was making this. I put this in just for all those folks in Florida. There's our baby alligator. I guess a lot of them didn't live in his aquarium there. And so he would, I guess, taxidermed it, wrapped it around this big abalone, red abalone shell from Monterey Bay. And they were selling the shell in Florida. And there it is right there. So I think I bored you guys enough, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was very fascinating. I really enjoyed that. We have a few questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and read them from the chat, and then I'll give you a chance to answer. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, this one is from Thomas. He asks, your favorite painting from Monterey Bay, the one with all the whale bones. What was the name of the artist who did that one?
You know, I knew you would ask me that, and for some reason, it's not. I am not thinking of it. So, to you, maybe you can get back to him with that.
Okay. Bob Murray, our sponsor tonight, he asks, is there still an abalone fishery in the Monterey area, or is it all fished out?
There is no abalone fishery in California whatsoever. So the California abalone fishery was disbanded in the 1990s. Primarily because the abalone, well, number one, there was a number of El Nino storms in California in the 1980s that ripped up all the kelp beds in Southern California, which abalone eat kelp. And also the abalone were affected with a thing called losing foot disease, which shrinks the abalone in the shell. And so it couldn't really protect itself. And so California Department of Fish and Game ended the abalone fishery, commercial fishery. And then just about 4 or 5 years ago, they stopped the sport fishery as well, which was operating up in Northern California. And now, so there is absolutely no fishery for abalone in California today. But there are abalone farms in California today, 6 of them.
Okay. How do the abalone get their shells so beautiful? Or do they eat something that makes them look like that, or is it just natural?
It's natural how they do that, yeah. But they get the red color. So a red color is because of what they eat. So the abalone in particular likes red kelp, and that's what they call red abalone because of the red kelp right there. But the beautiful iridescent color is just natural.
Okay. Elena asks, I know your area of expertise is on abalone in Monterey, but do you happen to know anything about the abalone trade in South Africa for quaaludes?
You know, I don't actually. I'm sorry.
Okay. We got a lot of, these aren't questions, but we got a lot of comments on your story about the diver using the abalone to seal his glass. People really, really enjoyed that. I also, that's a really great story. I just have one more question. So this question is actually for me. I know the pearling industry was really heavily affected when plastic was invented, and that kind of lessen the demand for pearling. So is there anything that kind of did this something similar to the abalone industry, or it just naturally went away because of the disease and the storms?
Yeah, it was a natural thing, but pearl, you know, abalone actually will produce pearls as well. Abalone pearls are kind of valuable sometimes. You can get them actually, and I ran across a letter from 1908 from the California Department of Fish and Game that was now in Monterey at that time. And it was sort of a top secret thing at that time. And they were working with a Japanese company in Monterey at Hopkins Marine Station, which is still here today, actually, in Monterey, part of Stanford University. And they were working with them to try to produce pearls, but that they just weren't very successful with it.
All right, thank you. That is all of our questions. If anyone has any additional questions, we are going to put this on YouTube, and you can leave them there, and I'll reach out to Tim to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank
we
you.
would like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. That was in the late 70s. I used to rely on abalone a lot for my dinners when I was young and had to feed myself some protein. Have to fight the seals for it. So I would miss that nowadays, but definitely understand and glad that they're being very proactive to protect the fisheries, and hopefully that it will come back.
You can get an abalone dinner in Monterey today.
Well, true with the
Get that dinner
farms.
It's about for an abalone dinner today. And that abalone is either farm raised or it's coming up from Mexico. In Mexico, they get red abalone as well. And it's very controversial because they don't monitor the fishery in Mexico. And what they're finding is there are guys who are poaching red abalone in Northern California, taking it down to Mexico, and then reselling it back to California.
Okay, well, hopefully they're getting caught doing that. So thank you for joining us. Julia, if you have anything else, but we appreciate it. We look forward to seeing everybody next month for our next Immerse Yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Tim, for your presentation. As a thank you, the History of Diving Museum would like to extend to you a membership for 1 year to the museum. So you're welcome to visit us 362 days a year. And we're going to go ahead and get that mailed off to you. So keep your eye on that. And if you are able to come to us within the next year, we hope we can see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody,
Night.
and thank you again.